The wind from the northern valley did not merely shake the window frames of the stone house. It rattled the iron bolts until the entire dining room felt unstable. Hazel sat at the end of the long pine table, her palms pressed against the rough grain of the wood to keep her hands from shaking. The room smelled of dried rosemary, roasted potatoes, and the sharp, clean scent of wax polish. It was a large, cold space in an old estate just outside the small town of Oak Haven, New York. There were no grand decorations on the walls, only plain wooden panels, and a single iron lantern hanging from the center beam. Hazel adjusted the high collar of her gray wool dress, which felt stiff against her skin. She was 26 years old, and she knew exactly how the local townspeople talked about her. They called her practical, quiet, and plain. They said she was a woman built for chores, not for courts. Across from her sat Arthur. He did not move with the hurried energy of a mortal man. His stark white hair caught the pale yellow light of the lantern, falling in sharp lines around a face that looked as though it had been carved from winter ice. His skin was completely pale, lacking any touch of blood or warmth, a clear mark of his nature as the vampire king of the Northern Territories. He wore a simple black coat without any gold trim or silver buttons, his broad shoulders squared against the high back of his chair. On his left index finger, a heavy iron ring sat cold against his skin. He was looking at a stack of paper sheets regarding the winter timber supplies for the local village. He used a small silver knife to slice a piece of dark bread, his movements rhythmic and completely silent. They had spent the last 2 hours discussing the cost of firewood and the repair of the valley's stone walls. It was a marriage arrangement born of necessity. Arthur needed someone who understood the local human laws, the grain markets, and the seasonal trade routes to keep his vast lands functioning without drawing the attention of the state authorities. Hazel needed an escape from her family house, where her parents viewed her as an expensive mouth to feed. Between them, a quiet agreement had grown over the past 3 months. It was not a bond built on sweet words or sudden promises. It was built on the steady weight of facts. Hazel pointed at a line of text on the paper closest to her plate. The shipping company in the harbor town wants $40 more for the river transport this season, she said, her voice steady and clear in the quiet room. They claim the ice is thicker near the mouth of the river. Arthur set the silver knife down. He did not look angry, but his dark eyes focused entirely on her face. "Then we will use the western road," he replied, his voice a low, smooth rumble that vibrated slightly against the stone floor. "The horses will take 2 days longer, but the road tax is paid. Your notes on the grain storage were correct, Hazel. The south cellar is dry. We will move the wheat before the next snow." Hazel felt a small knot of tension loosen in her shoulders. She liked the predictability of his mind. He did not play games with words, and he did not look past her as if she were invisible. The heavy oak doors of the dining room flew open with a loud slam that echoed off the high ceiling. The sudden rush of cold air from the main hallway instantly killed the flames of the 2 candles near the sideboard, casting the far side of the room into deep shadow. Hazel flinched, her hand jerking sideways and knocking against her ceramic water mug. The mug did not tip over, but a few cold drops spilled onto the clean linen cloth, leaving a dark, spreading stain. A high, bright laugh cut through the sound of the howling wind outside. It was a sound Hazel recognized instantly, a sound that made her stomach turn into a cold stone. Chloe stood in the open doorway, her cheeks pink from the outdoor chill and her golden hair falling in soft, perfect curls around her shoulders. At 22 years old, Chloe possessed the kind of beauty that made people stop talking when she entered a room. She wore a bright gown of gold silk that looked entirely out of place in the rustic stone house, the hem of the fabric wet with mud from the carriage ride. She smelled of expensive rose oil and sweet rain, an overwhelming scent that pushed away the honest smell of the roasted food. Arthur did not rise from his seat. He did not lower his bread. He simply turned his pale head toward the door, his white eyebrows drawing together in a slow, silent stare. "Surprise," Chloe said, stepping fully into the dining room. She pulled off her thin, white leather gloves and tossed them onto a side table, where they knocked over a small wooden salt cellar. She did not look back to see the mess she made. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Arthur, her smile wide and bright. The winter party down in the southern valley was completely dull, she continued, walking toward the table with light, bouncing steps. I told our father that I simply had to drive up the mountain to see my dear sister and give my personal congratulations on this upcoming marriage. The mountain road was terribly muddy, but I survived. Hazel tried to speak, but her throat felt dry and tight. The old, familiar feeling of being the dull, forgotten sister wrapped around her chest like an iron band. She was no longer the manager of the Silver Ridge estate. She was 12 years old again, standing in the cold kitchen while the town dressmaker praised Chloe's posture and ignored Hazel entirely. "Chloe," Hazel said, her voice sounding small and weak in her own ears. "You did not send a letter." "Letters are so incredibly boring, sweet sister," Chloe said, rounding the long table. She did not stop at Hazel's chair. Instead, she walked directly to Arthur's side of the table, stopping exactly 1 step away from his left arm. Hazel watched as Chloe tilted her head back, showing the long, pale line of her throat under the lantern light. "Your Grace," Chloe murmured, her voice dropping into a softer, slower rhythm that made Hazel press her fingernails into the palms of her hands. "I hope you will forgive me for arriving without an invitation. I am terribly impulsive sometimes. My father always says it is my greatest trouble." Arthur looked up at her face, then down at the wet mud dripping from the gold silk of her dress onto the polished floorboards. "You are ruining the wood," he said. His voice was flat, dry, and completely empty of the polite warmth that men usually showed when Chloe smiled at them. Chloe blinked, her bright smile freezing for a single second before she laughed again, a quick, nervous sound. "Oh, the rain is just a minor thing when it comes to family," she said, ignoring his comment entirely. Without waiting for Thomas, the old estate butler, to bring a proper seat, Chloe dragged a heavy wooden chair from the wall and forced it into the narrow space right next to Arthur at the head of the table. She sat down, her gold skirt billowing out and covering the side of Arthur's black coat. She was now sitting directly between them, creating a solid wall of gold fabric and rose perfume that cut Hazel off from the man across from her. Hazel looked down at the remaining potatoes on her plate, the food suddenly looking gray and unappetizing. The scratchy wool of her gray collar felt tighter around her neck. The quiet safety she had felt just 5 minutes ago was gone. Chloe had arrived to do what she had always done since they were children. Take the center of the room, break whatever Hazel was holding, and leave Hazel to clean up the pieces. For the next 20 minutes, Hazel sat completely still, her eyes fixed on a small knot in the pine table. She counted the rings in the wood. 1, 2, 3, 4. If she focused entirely on the numbers, she could block out the sound of Chloe's voice. Thomas came into the room and silently set a clean plate and a silver fork in front of Chloe. She did not touch the food. Instead, she rested her elbows on the table, turning her back halfway toward Hazel, so that she completely blocked her sister from the conversation. "I must admit, Your Grace," Chloe said, tilting her head toward Arthur as she watched him pick up his glass of water. "When Father told us that Hazel had managed to secure an agreement with the ruler of the Northern Valley, we were all completely shocked. We did not think she would ever leave the home parish." Hazel stopped counting the wood rings. Her breath caught in her throat. There it was, the first strike. "Shocked?" Arthur asked. He held the water glass by the rim, his pale, ink-stained thumb tracing the edge of the glass. He had not looked at Hazel since Chloe sat down, and the cold weight in Hazel's chest grew heavier. He was listening to her. Everyone always listened to Chloe. "Well, you must understand how Hazel is," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a tone that sounded like sweet pity, but felt like a needle. She leaned a little closer to Arthur's shoulder, the smell of rose oil growing thicker. "Hazel has always been so quiet. She is very domestic, really. When we were growing up in the town, I was always out riding horses or attending the winter festivals with the local families, and Hazel was always sitting in the kitchen corner mending old socks or doing the laundry accounts. We used to joke that she would end up marrying the old village clerk just to stay near the paper piles." Hazel felt the color leave her face. Her hands shook beneath the table, so she wrapped them tightly into the fabric of her skirt until her knuckles turned white. It was true. She had mended the socks. She had stayed inside during the loud, crowded town festivals because the noise and the staring people made her feel sick. Chloe took Hazel's desire for peace and turned it into something pathetic. "The village clerk," Arthur repeated. His face showed absolutely no expression, and his voice was impossible to read. "Oh, yes," Chloe continued, encouraged by his response. She reached her hand across the corner of the table, her fingers hovering just an inch above Arthur's black sleeve, not quite touching the cloth, but close enough to show a strange familiarity. "She is terribly afraid of the wider world, Your Grace. At my winter debut ball 3 years ago, she hid herself in the carriage house for 4 hours because a local merchant asked her to walk across the room with him. She has the spirit of a small field mouse. I only worry that managing a vast northern estate like Silver Ridge will completely break her health. It is a massive amount of work, and Hazel gets confused so easily when things become loud. It was a perfect performance. To anyone else in the valley, it would have sounded like the honest worry of a loving younger sister. But Hazel knew the real meaning behind every word. Chloe was telling Arthur that Hazel was weak, boring, and an embarrassment to have at his side. She was telling him to look at the gold dress instead of the gray wool. Hazel wanted to speak up. She wanted to tell Arthur that she had not hid in the carriage house because she was afraid. She had gone there to fix the long tear in Chloe's own gown after Chloe had fallen into the rose bushes while flirting with a young officer. But the words stayed stuck in her throat. The weight of 20 years of being the invisible sister sat too heavy on her chest. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with Chloe only made Hazel look bitter and angry in front of strangers. Chloe was like running water. She could twist away from any accusation and leave you looking like the one who caused the mess. So Hazel remained silent. She closed her eyes for a short second, waiting for the inevitable end. The agreement would be broken. Arthur would realize he had chosen a plain, frightened woman when he could have had something bright. He would look at the golden sister, realize he had made a poor bargain, and send Hazel back to her father's house by the morning light. Speaking of the estate work, Chloe said, moving smoothly to her next point now that she believed the ground was prepared. She reached out and picked up Arthur's silver water glass, ignoring her own clean mug. She took a slow sip, leaving a small mark of her lip wax on the cold metal rim. It was a bold, sudden movement that broke every rule of polite company. "I noticed your horse barns as my carriage drove into the yard," she said. "I am an excellent rider. Hazel is terrified of the large draft animals, of course, but I practically live in the saddle. Perhaps tomorrow morning you could show me the mountain trails. The townspeople say your black horses are the finest in the state." Hazel stared at the small smudge on Arthur's silver glass. The dining room suddenly felt far too warm. The logs in the fireplace were burning high now, throwing long, shaking shadows across the stone ceiling. She felt a slight wave of nausea. The heavy smell of the rose oil was mixing with the warm grease of the roasted potatoes, turning her stomach. She wanted to stand up and run. She wanted to excuse herself, walk up the dark stairs to her small, cold bedroom, pack her 2 gray wool dresses, and leave the estate before the final words were spoken. She shifted her weight in the wooden chair, preparing to push herself back from the table. She would tell them she had a headache from the winter wind. She would leave, just as she always did. "Are you finished?" Arthur's voice cut through the warm, heavy air of the room like a cold blade. Hazel froze in her seat. Chloe stopped talking, the silver glass still held halfway to her face. She blinked her large blue eyes, her perfect eyebrows drawing together in confusion. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice tilting upward. Arthur finally turned his head to look directly at her. He did not look charmed, and he did not look amused. He looked down at Chloe's face with the exact same cold, flat expression he had used earlier when he discovered a patch of wet rot in the floorboards of the grain cellar. "Are you finished talking?" he asked again. He did not raise his tone, but the sheer weight of his words seemed to draw all the air out of the space around them. Chloe offered a small, hesitant laugh, sensing that the conversation had changed but not yet understanding why her usual tricks were failing. "Well, I was only trying to make polite conversation for the evening, she said, her voice dropping its confident tone. You were making a cold draft, Arthur said flatly, and you are drinking from my glass. The silence that followed his words was completely absolute. Hazel stopped breathing entirely. The only sound left in the large room was the steady crackle of the oak logs in the fireplace and the heavy, slow ticking of the iron clock in the corner. Chloe stared at him, her lips parted in genuine shock. A dark red color began to creep up her pale neck, ruining the perfect look of her face. Slowly, her hand shaking slightly, she lowered the silver glass back to the table surface. I am sorry, she whispered. I thought we were being informal among family. We are not, Arthur said. He did not soften the words with a small smile or a polite nod. He simply reached his long, pale hand forward, picked up the silver glass by its base, and placed it far across the table, completely out of Chloe's reach. He then pulled a clean linen cloth from his lap and slowly wiped the spot on the pine wood where the wet glass had left a small ring of water. Chloe looked as though she had been struck across the face. The bright, confident look around her seemed to fade away. For the first time in her life, her beauty had hit a solid, cold wall that did not care about her gold dress or her blue eyes. Arthur did not spend another second looking at her discomfort. He dismissed her completely. He shifted his broad shoulders in his chair, turning his massive frame so that his back was now angled toward Chloe, cutting her off from his view. He looked straight across the long expanse of the pine table at Hazel. Hazel's heart gave a sudden, painful thud against her ribs. She met his eyes. They were dark, steady, and completely clear, showing no sign of confusion or hesitation. Hazel, Arthur said, his voice losing the sharp, icy edge and returning to the quiet, regular rumble they had used before the door opened. Before we were interrupted by the wind, you were telling me about the difference in the timber reports from the lower river valley. Hazel blinked twice. Her mind was spinning in circles. He was not looking at Chloe at all. He was asking her about river transport bills. Ah, yes, she said, her voice sounding dry and rough. She swallowed hard, trying to find her steady voice again. The lower valley, yes. I noticed that the wood numbers did not match the delivery slips from the month of November. Exactly, Arthur nodded, resting his large elbows on the wood table and leaning forward, closing the distance between them. I missed that number entirely when I looked at the sheets last week. My valley manager is either lazy or he is taking money from the local builders. I think it is the second one. I would like you to look through the old books for the northern farms tomorrow morning after breakfast. I trust your eyes more than I trust his reports. Hazel felt a strange, warm feeling spread through her chest. It was not the flutter of a romantic story. It was the solid weight of respect. He was not just putting up with her. He was using her intelligence as a shield against Chloe's silly talk. Chloe, unable to stay quiet while being ignored, tried to force her way back into the space. She leaned forward over the table, her voice louder than before. Timber reports? Good heavens, Hazel. You will bore his grace to death with those dry papers. Surely you do not mean to spend your time here looking at dusty numbers. Arthur did not turn around. He did not even glance at her. He kept his eyes fixed on Hazel and spoke without a pause. Lady Chloe, he said, his voice dropping into a low tone that made the small hairs on Hazel's arms stand up. If I wanted to be entertained by empty talk and pretty stories, I would hire a traveling theater group from the city. I am marrying your sister because she has a mind that functions, a strong spine, and the rare ability to sit in a room without demanding that every eye look at her. Chloe let out a sharp, ugly gasp. Arthur continued speaking, shifting his dark eyes just enough to look at Chloe out of the corner of his face. Furthermore, he said, if you ever speak to my future wife in that tone of voice within my house again, you will find yourself riding your horse back down the mountain road in the dark. Do you understand me? Hazel's hands uncurled beneath the table. The tight grip she had on her gray wool skirt relaxed, and she felt the warm blood return to her fingers. Chloe's mouth opened and closed twice, but no sound came out. The red color had reached her hair. Stripped of her usual charms and denied an audience, she looked suddenly very small and very young. I meant no disrespect, she whispered, her confidence entirely gone. Then you are simply careless. Arthur replied, turning his attention away from her as if she were no longer there. He looked back at Hazel, the hard lines of his pale face softening just a tiny bit. He reached his long hand across the dark pine table. The table was wide, so he could not reach her fingers, but he rested his pale fingertips on the wood a few inches from her white plate. It was a bridge between them. The northern farms, he prompted gently. Hazel looked at his pale hand on the wood. The skin over his knuckles was smooth and cold, but it felt stable. She took a deep breath, and for the first time since the heavy oak doors had blown open, she did not smell the rose oil. She smelled the dried rosemary from the kitchen. She smelled the fresh wax polish on the wood. She smelled a real future. The northern farms, Hazel said, her voice steady, clear and completely her own. I will need the quarterly tax books brought to the small study after breakfast tomorrow. Arthur's lips moved slightly. It was not a full smile, but in the shaking light of the lantern, it was the most beautiful thing Hazel had ever seen. Consider it done, he said. The freezing winter rain beat against the small window panes of the corner bedroom later that night, sounding like handfuls of small stones thrown against the glass by an angry spirit. Hazel lay completely still beneath 3 heavy wool blankets. The small fire in the brick hearth had burned down to a pile of gray ash, giving off a tiny hiss whenever a stray drop of rain found its way down the chimney pipe. The air in the bedroom was incredibly cold, and her toes felt numb inside her socks. Yet her mind was wide awake, her thoughts moving too fast for sleep. She stared at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling, barely visible in the midnight gloom. The energy from the dining room confrontation had gone, leaving behind a deep, hollow tiredness. She replayed the scene over and over in her head. She thought about the angle of Arthur's white hair, the flat delivery of his words, and the defeated look on Chloe's face. It still felt like a dangerous dream. 26 years of being told she was second best did not disappear because a man scolded her sister across a dining table. Hazel knew how the world worked. Men were creatures who liked bright, shiny things. They always went back to the beautiful objects once they grew tired of the sensible ones. Arthur had defended her tonight. Yes, he had set a firm boundary. But tomorrow, in the cold light of the morning, when he saw Chloe standing in the yard with the sun on her golden hair, looking small and sorry for herself, he might change his mind. Hazel squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands against her face until small spots of light danced in her darkness. She hated the cynical thoughts in her own head, but she had spent her life waiting for the second shoe to drop. The second shoe always dropped. She threw the heavy blankets off her legs. The sudden rush of freezing air made her catch her breath. She pulled her thick wool robe from the wooden post at the foot of the bed, shoving her arms into the sleeves and tying the simple rope belt in a tight knot around her waist. She slid her feet into her flat leather slippers. If she was going to be awake all night, she was not going to spend it staring at a dark ceiling, waiting to be sent away. She opened her bedroom door and stepped out into the long corridor. The estate house at night was a loud, groaning thing. The old oak timbers settled against the winter cold with loud popping sounds that echoed down the empty hallways. The air smelled of old stone, damp plaster, and years of dust. There were no oil lamps lit along the walls, only the weak white light of the winter moon coming through the high windows. Hazel walked slowly, wrapping her arms tightly around her chest to stay warm. She did not have a specific place to go. She only needed to keep moving forward. She passed the long row of dark family portraits, ignoring the painted eyes of long-dead valley elders. She passed the closed door of Chloe's guest room, noting with a bitter feeling that no light showed beneath the wood. Chloe was likely sleeping without a care. People who did not worry about others usually slept very well. At the very end of the eastern hallway, a thin line of warm yellow light spilled across the dark wool rug. It came from the door of the estate study. The heavy wood was standing slightly open. Hazel stopped in her tracks. She held her breath, listening carefully to the house. The steady, heavy sound of the winter rain hitting the stone terrace outside was the only noise. There were no voices, no sound of movement. She stepped closer, her soft leather slippers making absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. She looked through the narrow opening of the door. Arthur, sat at a massive square desk made of dark walnut wood. The fire in the large hearth behind his chair was burning bright, throwing a deep orange glow over his broad shoulders and his white hair. He had taken off his formal black coat. He was sitting in his white linen shirt, the fabric looking very bright against the dark wood walls of the room. His neckcloth was gone, and the high collar of his shirt was unbuttoned, showing a small triangle of his pale skin at his throat. He wore a pair of thin silver spectacles on his nose, and his white hair, which was usually brushed back perfectly, was messy, as if he had run his fingers through it many times. He was completely surrounded by paper, stacks of leather-bound books, loose sheets of old parchment, and large maps covered every inch of the dark walnut desk. He held a small black pen, writing down long columns of numbers with quick, heavy movements of his hand. He looked tired. He looked weighted down by the work. He looked entirely real. Hazel pushed the heavy oak door open. The old metal hinges gave a tiny, quiet squeak. Arthur did not jump or look up quickly. He simply stopped his pen. He kept his eyes fixed on the paper sheet for 3 full seconds before he slowly lifted his white head. The silver spectacles caught the orange light of the fire, hiding his eyes for a moment before he lowered his chin to look at her over the metal rims. "It is 3 o'clock in the morning," he said. His voice was thick with fatigue, stripped of the formal tone he used during the daylight hours. "The rain was too loud," Hazel said, standing in the doorway. It was a small lie. Her voice sounded thin and dry from the cold hallway air. She stepped fully into the warm room, crossing the line from the freezing corridor into the thick heat of the study. The space smelled of burning wood, strong black coffee, and the sharp scent of fresh ink. Arthur looked at her plain wool robe. He looked at her dark hair, which was not pinned up, but hung in a loose, untidy bunch over her shoulders. He did not tell her she looked pretty in the firelight, because she did not, and they both knew it. "The Northern Farm books are a complete mess," he said flatly, dropping the black pen onto the desk wood. It hit with a sharp clatter. He pinched the skin between his eyes, pushing his silver spectacles up into his hair. "You were entirely right about the Valley Manager. The grain numbers do not match the delivery notes. But the problem is much bigger than that. The timber contracts from the past summer are completely missing from the ledger," Arthur said, his eyes tracking Hazel as she walked closer to the desk. "Either the man is stealing the wood to sell to the southern builders, or he is using my money to pay off his own personal debts in the town. I cannot understand the strange marks he has left in the margins of the pages." Hazel walked until she reached the edge of the large walnut desk. The high heat from the fireplace hit her back, warming her through the thin wool of her robe. She stood across from him, looking down at the chaotic pile of papers and ink bottles. "May I look?" she asked. Arthur made a small movement with his pale hand. "If you want to hurt your eyes at this hour, go ahead," he replied. Hazel pulled a heavy leather chair closer to the edge of the desk. She sat down, pulling the old leather book he had been reading toward her side of the wood. The paper felt rough and dry under her fingertips. The ink was a dark brown color, and the handwriting was small, crowded, and messy. She recognized the look of the pages. It was the work of a man who was trying very hard to hide his tracks from an employer. She leaned over the book, the old smell of the paper and glue filling her nose and making her feel focused. She scanned the long columns of numbers. Numbers were safe things. They did not change their minds, they did not try to trick you, and they never wore gold silk dresses. "He is not using a secret code," Hazel whispered, her fingers tracing a line of expenses for winter tools. She reached out without thinking, taking the black pen from the desk where Arthur had dropped it. The wood of the pen was still slightly warm from his fingers. She dipped the metal point into the small glass ink bottle, ignoring the way Arthur shifted his chair 2 inches closer to watch her movements. "Look right here," she said, pointing the tip of the pen at a row of entries, leaving a tiny black dot on the old paper. "He is listing the heavy timber shipments under the section for winter horse feed. He is moving the decimal points to the left. 10 large wagon loads of oak wood become 100 bags of grain. He balances the missing wood by creating fake receipts for feed that the estate, animals never actually received or ate. Arthur leaned his shoulder over the desk, his arm brushing against hers. The physical touch was very small, just the thin, white linen of his shirt against the rough gray wool of her robe. But it felt like a sudden shock of electricity in the quiet room. He smelled of pine needles, plain soap, and the cold winter air. It was not a romantic scent, but it felt solid and real. He stared down at the open page, his dark eyes following her pen as she drew a simple line connecting the fake timber numbers to the high feed costs. He did not speak for a very long time. The old iron clock in the corner made a heavy, loud sound as the seconds passed. "I am an idiot," Arthur finally said, his voice a low, rough rumble against the sound of the fire. "I have been staring at these exact pages for 4 hours tonight." "You are not an idiot," Hazel said, keeping her eyes fixed on the numbers. She was afraid that if she looked up at his pale face so close to hers, she would lose her composure. "You are looking at the books like a ruler. You expect to find grand crimes, complex political plots, or brilliant financial tricks. This is the simple theft of a desperate ordinary man who thinks no one will take the time to read the boring pages." Arthur let out a short, quick breath through his nose. It might have been his version of a laugh. He leaned back into the high leather seat, crossing his long arms over his chest. He looked at her face, and Hazel could feel the steady weight of his gaze against her cheek. She kept her jaw tight, turning the heavy paper page with a slow, deliberate movement. "Your sister is an exceptionally beautiful woman," Arthur said softly. The words hit Hazel like a cold stone in her chest. Her hand stopped moving on the paper. The black pen hovered over the ledger, a small drop of dark ink growing larger at the tip, ready to fall and ruin the page. Her ribs felt tight, as if she could not draw enough air into her lungs. There it was, the moment she had been waiting for all night, the change of mind. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat, refusing to look up from the book. She placed the pen back on its silver rest. "Yes, she is," Hazel said. "Everyone in the valley says so. She is entirely aware of her face as well," Arthur continued, his tone remaining regular and conversational, as if they were discussing the price of winter oats. "She uses her beauty like a heavy iron hammer. She expects every person in the room to flatten themselves before she even strikes." Hazel traced the rough outer edge of the leather book with her thumb. "It usually works for her," she said quietly. "I am sure it does," Arthur agreed, his chair creaking as he shifted his weight. He leaned forward again, resting his long forearms on the dark walnut wood, forcing Hazel to either look into his face or stare directly at his sleeves. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet his gaze. His pale face was completely serious in the orange light, the shadows making his cheekbones look sharp and deep. "I have spent a very long time surrounded by people who smile at me because of my name and my lands," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low tone that required her full attention. "I have dealt with flatterers, liars, and beautiful women who have absolutely nothing behind their eyes except a small calculation of what my position can buy for them. I am tired, Hazel. I am deeply, deeply tired of the noise." Hazel gripped her own knees beneath the desk wood. She did not know what to say to him. This was not the kind of talk she had prepared herself for. "When I sent the message to your father regarding this arrangement," Arthur continued, keeping his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. Though she forced herself to remain still, I told him that I required a real partner for the estate. I did not want a show horse for the village festivals. I did not want a pretty ornament for my front room. I wanted a person who could look at a broken wall or a bad contract and tell me exactly how many days it would take to fix it. I wanted someone who would not run away when the roof leaked or the winter grew too long. He reached his long arm forward. He did not grab her fingers. He simply pressed his pale palm flat against the walnut wood right next to the ledger she was holding. "Your sister walked into my dining room tonight and tried to sell me a colorful story," Arthur said, his lip curling slightly in distaste. "She tried to show me the exact same exhausting, fake performance that every city woman uses. I live up in this cold valley to get away from that nonsense. And she expected me to praise her for it because she thinks all men are weak. She thinks we only look at gold silk." Hazel stared at his large, pale hand on the dark wood. The dark ink mark was still visible on his thumb from his earlier work. Most men are weak when it comes to her, she whispered, the old bitterness showing through her words despite her efforts to hide it. Perhaps that is true for humans, Arthur allowed. But I am not marrying your sister. I am marrying the woman who discovered a theft in my books at 3 o'clock in the morning in a freezing room. He pulled his hand back from the desk, sitting up straight in his high chair. The close, intense space between them opened up, allowing Hazel to take a full, deep breath of the warm air. Go back to your bed, Hazel, he said, his voice turning back into the practical, firm tone of the estate owner. He picked up his black pen once more. We will dismiss the valley manager tomorrow after breakfast. I need you to be rested. We have a large territory to run, and the snow is coming. Hazel stood up from the leather chair. Her legs felt a bit shaky under her wool robe, but her chest felt lighter than it had in years. She looked at his messy white hair, his tired eyes, and his plain, honest expression. He was not a savior from a storybook. He was a cold, tired person with a ruined book of numbers, and he wanted her because she was useful. Good night, Arthur, she said. He did not look up from the page, but his pen stopped for a split second. Good night, Hazel, he said. She walked back to her room, and the long hallways did not feel quite so cold anymore. A pale, flat gray light entered the windows of the small breakfast room the next morning with the steady, unfeeling movement of a late autumn day. The winter rain still beat against the glass panes, turning the gravel driveway outside into a wide lane of soft gray mud. Inside the room, the wood fire in the small fireplace struggled against the damp wind that whistled through the old mortar joints. The air held the sharp, burnt smell of wood smoke mixed with the dark, heavy scent of boiling coffee. Hazel sat at a small oak table near the eastern window. She wore a simple dark green dress that buttoned all the way up to her chin, the rough wool rubbing against her skin with a familiar, sensible friction that kept her focused on the present moment. She held a thick ceramic mug of black tea between her hands, using the warmth of the clay to heat her cold fingers. Her eyes felt heavy and hot from the few hours of sleep she had managed after leaving the study, but the old, sharp knot of worry that had lived under her ribs for 20 years was gone. In its place was a simple, heavy tiredness. It was the clean fatigue of someone who had done a hard day of real work. She traced a small scratch in the oak wood, enjoying the deep quiet of the house. Heavy, slow footsteps sounded in the stone hallway outside, moving without any hurry. Arthur walked into the breakfast room, wearing his high leather riding boots and a dark wool coat that smelled of the outdoors. The fabric carried the wet, earthy scent of the stables, damp straw, and old leather soap. He did not offer any polite morning greetings or ask about her sleep. He walked straight to the long wooden sideboard, poured himself a mug of black coffee, and took 2 pieces of hard cold bread from a basket. He pulled out the heavy wooden chair directly across from Hazel. The legs of the chair made a loud, scraping shriek against the floorboards that broke the quiet of the morning. The valley manager is currently packing his clothes into a single bag, Arthur stated, chewing his bread slowly as he stared down at the grain of the table. I gave him exactly 1 hour to leave the property. I told him that if his face is ever seen on my northern lands again, the town sheriff will lock him in the stone jail down in Oakhaven. Hazel took a small sip of her hot tea. Did he try to explain the horse feed number, she asked. He cried, Arthur said, his voice completely flat and empty of any sympathy. He tried to say the stable boy had altered the receipts. When I laid the 3 fake delivery sheets on the table in front of his face, his legs shook, and he fell down against the wood. It was a very pathetic sight. You saved this estate a large amount of money, Hazel. It was only simple addition, she replied, looking down at her mug. It was competence, Arthur corrected her, lifting his dark eyes to look straight into her face. The heavy wooden door of the breakfast room opened with a slow, whining sound from the iron hinges. Chloe stood on the threshold, but the bright, glowing look from the previous evening was gone. She wore a plain, dark red traveling dress that looked heavy and uncomfortable, and her golden hair was pulled back tightly beneath a stiff leather bonnet that hid her curls. Without her gold silk gown, she looked surprisingly ordinary in the gray light of the window. Her skin looked pale and yellow, and her lips were pressed into a thin, tight line. She gripped her leather riding gloves with white fingers, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. Neither Arthur nor Hazel stood up to welcome her. "Good morning," Chloe said. The bright, musical tone of her voice was cracked, hiding a deep, frantic anger. Arthur did not lift his eyes from his coffee mug. "Lady Chloe," he said, "I noticed your leather trunks were being tied to the back of the carriage in the yard. You are leaving early." It was a cold, direct statement that left no room for argument. Chloe swallowed hard, a dark red flush rising from her collar up into her face. "A messenger arrived from the village road at dawn," she lied, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to maintain her pride. The deception was completely obvious. Everyone in the county knew the mountain pass was closed to night riders during the heavy winter rains. "Our father sent an urgent note regarding the land leases in the Southern Valley," she continued, looking away from Arthur's face. "He requires my immediate presence at the main house to help with the guests." Hazel watched her younger sister from across the small oak table, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. She had spent her entire life being terrified of this girl, letting Chloe's sharp words and selfish actions define what she was worth. Now, looking at the golden sister as she stumbled over obvious lies in a damp room, Hazel felt nothing but a distant, quiet pity. "How very sad," Arthur murmured, turning a page of his small leather account book. "I am sure your knowledge of land leases is just as great as your understanding of my black horses." Chloe flinched as if she had been touched by a hot iron. Seeing that her beauty had no power in this house, she turned her anger toward the only person she had ever been able to hurt. "I hope you enjoy this cold stone tomb, Hazel," Chloe spat out, her voice dropping into a sharp, venomous whisper that echoed in the quiet breakfast room. "I hope you enjoy spending your life looking at dusty papers and old books. You belong in the corners with the dust." Hazel set her ceramic tea mug down on the table, the heavy clay making a solid clack against the wood. She did not look away from her sister's angry blue eyes. "I think I like the dust very much, Chloe," Hazel said softly. "Dust is an honest thing. It always settles exactly where it belongs on the floor. It never spends its time pretending to be gold silk." Chloe stepped back toward the hallway, her face white with surprise at the lack of fear in Hazel's voice. She looked at Hazel's face, searching for the familiar flinch or the tears she usually caused. But she found only a calm, steady expression. Unable to stay in a room where no one cared about her presence, Chloe turned around, her boots clicking loudly as she ran down the stone corridor and slammed the heavy front door behind her. Outside the window, the iron wheels of the carriage ground loudly against the wet stones of the yard. A leather whip cracked once, the sound bouncing off the high stone walls of the old house. Hazel watched through the gray glass as the dark carriage tore through the mud, disappearing into the white mist that hung over the pine trees along the mountain avenue. The old, invisible hands that had held her throat for 26 years seemed to melt away into the rain. Arthur finished his black coffee and stood up from the oak table, his tall frame blocking the light from the window. "The carpenter is coming to look at the roof of the western barn at 10 o'clock, he said, shifting his mind immediately back to the regular business of the land. "The man has a reputation for being a thief in the town. He always tries to charge for more wood than he uses on the beams." Hazel picked up her tea, which had grown cold, and drank the rest of it. She liked the bitter, clean taste it left in her mouth. "I will bring the contract sheets from the last spring repair out to the yard," she said, her voice clear and firm. "If he tries to increase the price of the pine wood, we will show him the notes on the bad work he did on the valley fence." Arthur stopped near the door, turning his white head back to look at her. The hard, frozen lines of his pale face relaxed for a second, and a tiny, almost hidden smile showed at the corners of his mouth. It was a private understanding between them in the cold morning. "I feel sorry for the carpenter," he murmured, and then he walked out into the hall. Hazel remained at the small oak table for a few minutes longer, the house around her feeling quiet and solid. She looked down at her own right hand, noting a tiny smudge of dark ink that still clung to the skin near her thumb from the night work in the study. There were no songs playing in the background, and there were no grand, dramatic promises spoken between them. There were only old books of numbers, a dishonest carpenter from the town, and a cup of cold tea on a plain table. She ran her finger along the edge of her mug, a slow, real smile coming across her face for the first time in many years. It was going to be an exceptionally good life. Looking out at the gray valley as the fog began to lift from the pine trees, Hazel realized that the true change in her life had not come from a sudden piece of magic or a grand declaration. It had come from the simple willingness to be seen for exactly what she was. For 26 years, she had lived under the belief that she was merely the background of her sister's bright story, a plain creature meant to hold the lights while someone else danced in the center of the floor. She had thought that her love for numbers, her need for quiet, and her practical view of the world were defects that would keep her lonely in a corner. But in the cold rooms of Silver Ridge, those exact traits had become her strength. Arthur did not look at her with the temporary excitement of a man who had found a new toy. He looked at her with the steady, permanent regard of a person who had found a necessary anchor in a long storm. They were both unusual creatures in their own ways, one touched by the long winter of his nature, and the other by the quiet isolation of her youth. Yet together, they fit like two pieces of a well-made iron lock. The future before them did not look like a bright, easy summer road. It looked like a long, cold northern winter filled with hard work, leaky roofs, and difficult choices. But as she watched the wood smoke rise from the kitchen chimney into the gray sky, Hazel felt no fear of the cold. She knew she had the intelligence to balance the books, the strength to stand against the wind, and a partner who valued the mind behind the gray wool dress. It was a life built on facts, and facts were the only things that never dissolved in the rain.